Um, Pick up, Mark used the phrase government seeks winners. Well, there's a kind of battle that's gone on, certainly for the last 20, probably 30 years in the UK, and I think it's probably again true here. Go back for a second. Shaun was very nice about the speech on November 4th in the Lords, but in fact that was in a debate in which 20 speakers spoke from all parties. And an absolute consensus emerged, and they were extremely knowledgeable speakers. Two former chairs of the newspaper groups, former chairman of the Select Committee on Communications, Conservative. So we had a very clear consensus. Anyone wants to go online and see that Hansard of November the 4th, it's no question about what Parliament, or certainly the House of Lords, is saying. And I think it'd be very strange if government didn't listen. But the battle that's going on is an interesting one. And it's really, the way I've typified it, rather simplistically, is a battle between our roles as citizens and our roles as consumers. And the problem we've had, I think, in the West, is consistently governments have rolled over in favour of pleasing the consumer, if necessary at the expense of the citizen. And the danger with that is the citizen, treating the citizen as a consumer means that very, very important issues become marginalised, i.e. your responsibility as a consumer, your sense of security for your family and their future as a consumer. And what happens is the slogan that the consumer advocates fly under is the notion of choice. Well, choice is quite an interesting thing, but it actually isn't. It doesn't come down to many choices when you're talking about the future of your country, where your country is going, what fundamental decisions it makes about its future. So my argument has been, and I think basically still the majority argument within Parliament in the UK, is the citizen trumps the consumer every time there's a choice. And of course, at times these two things are in conflict. There's many occasions on which the roles and responsibilities of the citizen are somewhat in conflict with the rights and responsibilities, if you like, of the consumer. But the citizen must trump. And this comes right back, in a sense, Jeff, to your very first question. If the citizen is to trump, then you must have a public information service which does not have an agenda, which is publicly funded and well-resourced, because otherwise the citizen will inevitably lose out to the consumer. And societies in which that's happened, the United States is the society which unquestionably it's drifted the furthest, suffer. They don't benefit, they do suffer. And just a small example of how pernicious the political axis can be. We're being urged now by the new Conservative government, and I speak very much as a man of the left, we're being urged that in our own interests, we drop our annual reports to Ofcom, i.e. effectively to Parliament at Channel 4. No reason to do these annual reports. They're cumbersome, they're bureaucratic, you can drop them. Interesting enough, we as a board, Terry Burns, who's in the House of Lords as the chairman, and myself as deputy chairman, said, we don't want to drop them. Actually, they're very helpful to us. They are the one occasion where statutorily, as a board, we are required to investigate what we're doing, to look carefully at what we're doing, and to explain what we're doing, and if necessary, to question what we're doing. If you take that away from us, in a strange way, we are disempowered. We're not empowered. We're disempowered from asking ourselves absolutely fundamental questions, which as a public service broadcaster, we ought to be asking. But of course, as I said, the siren argument, which is, well, it's another large document. It tends to be around 80 pages. You have to go through it in detail. You have to argue it out as a board. We're going to relieve you of all that responsibility. Please don't. I like responsibility. In fact, the reason I'm sitting here at the moment is because I absorb and enjoy responsibility. I don't want to become simply a consumer walking around the corner to an arcade, decide which DVD player I want to buy next. Life's about more than that. And I think that as simplistic as that must sound, and I'm aware of when I say it does, that actually is what this debate's about. This debate is why we're here, what are the big decisions that affect our lives, how do we protect our ability to make those decisions well.
Understood. Local programming, independent production on the public broadcasters. Both Mark and Shaun, David, have been intimately involved with SPAR, with our development of strategies and going to Canberra. But we're finding in Canberra there's increasingly this attitude that in terms of the local voices and the local screen image, maybe it's all too hard in the digital age. Local content regulation, which applies to the commercial broadcasters, along with the spend requirement for pay TV. How do we manage that into the future where, the Nine network will just not have one analogue channel, it'll have, at the moment it's got an analogue and two digitals, and with compression technologies developing the way they are, 2020, Channel 9 might have 2 HDs and 3 standard defs. Oh, it's all too hard. Just give the money to the public broadcasters so they can be the commissioners of Australian programming, kids, adults, drama and documentary. It seems to me a hell of a risk in this. Not that we're reflecting on the capacities of the two public broadcasters to deliver, but it goes to the issue of diversity. Now, you talked earlier, Mark, about the commercial broadcasters not doing a 7:30 report, or certainly not doing a Four Corners. I agree. But if you're working in the area of kids, for instance, I think there's a real threat if we want to quarantine kids' Australian programming to one channel. And I'm not being derogatory here, but for instance, High Five, which was on Channel 9, is a real Channel 9 show. And Tim, is he there, Tim? I don't want to reflect on Tim. But Tim Brookhunt probably would not have commissioned that as an ABC3 program. It's all about the diversity issue. So in developing these strategies, we've got to be careful that we don't fall for the trap, which would be lovely for you guys. Mark, here's 250 million. Shaun, here's another 150 million. It solves the problem for us. You just do it.
I think we'd like the money, but not the responsibility of being sole providers, if that's okay. I mean, that's not our starting point. I mean, our starting point in talking with government isn't just saying they don't want to do it, we're happy to do it, give it all to us. That doesn't create the vibrant kind of sector, and I suspect the plurality of programming and commissioning decisions that ideally made. And I think there are numbers of very successful programs, Australian content on commercial television that probably wouldn't have been commissioned by the ABC, and even if we had more channels, may not be commissioned by the ABC, that is part of the palette that you want to make available. And we also recognise that not everybody watches the ABC, and you want to reach all Australians with this breadth of content. However, that said, we would happily increase the percentage of Australian content on ABC television. We would like to do that much more drama. And I suppose if push came to shove on it, if the government was really going to trade away the regulatory burden that they were putting on commercial television and allowing them to walk away from those current obligations, then we would be there willing and able to take up the slack. But that's not the position that we are advocating, and nor do we think that's the position that gives you the healthy dynamic that should exist in the television marketplace.
Mark Thompson at the McTaggart lecture in Edinburgh in August came up with an interesting idea, reflecting on one of the strengths of British television has been its diversity of funding. Because they do cluster Channel 4, 5 and ITV channels as public broadcasters. They have a fully funded, government-funded BBC, and the other public broadcasters are reliant on commercial revenue. And that's the area that's under greatest risk, although I guess the BBC freezing of the licence fee in the last week or so has put them under increased pressure as well. But he did say in the lecture that one option would be to start levying other areas of the sector, or encouraging pay TV to pick up its obligations. He was very critical of Sky not carrying anything like the same level of responsibility for local programming as the free-to-air networks had done. Look, I mean, obviously, SBS would never anticipate being in a dominant position in the market, so I don't think you could ever look at us as being a threat in that regard. But we do need that 150 million you've spoken about, and happy to take the cheque. The thing I would point out as well, that as part of our charter, is to make use of Australia's diverse creative resources. So we have an inbuilt statutory obligation to pursue that. And it was one of the reasons why in 2006 I went to the board with a policy recommendation that we abandon all internal production and move to a Channel 4 model of full commissioning. Actually, not quite the full extent, because we still do news, current affairs and sport for obvious reasons in-house. But all of the rest of our funds go to the independent sector. And looking back over the numbers, when I arrived as head of television in 2003, SBSI, which was doing a wonderful job, was still only spending $5 million on commissioned content. And since then, partly through the controversial decision to put ads in programs, but also by reducing overheads and cutting back on other expenditure areas, we've lifted the spend in the independent production sector on television, certainly over 30 in some years. It's hovering around mid-20s this year, I know. And that's really driven by our belief that what SBSI did as an experiment, was something on which we should build our whole model on. So that commitment to diversity is absolute. The only issue, of course, you left then was even if you're committed to diversity, it's quite reasonable for the independent sector to say, yeah, but you're a single gatekeeper. Well, we're two gatekeepers. And that's important to keep that diversity going as well.
Yeah, I think I can add to the debate by just citing something that's gone on in the last 2 months. You know, in my judgment, lamentable decision by the government to close the UK Film Council resulted in a series of hurried and unnecessarily hurried discussions about what was going to be done to find a home for the lottery money, 15 million, roughly, pounds of lottery money that was available for film funding. And among other people approached, there weren't that many people approached, were we at Channel 4. And we had long, hard, serious discussions about it. And I think correctly, in fact I know correctly, decided that we didn't want that money. We didn't want responsibility for that money. Because the inevitable consequence of that money was you were going to reduce the amount of windows that a producer had to go to achieve funding. At the moment we have at least three quite healthy windows. You had the UKFC with its 15 million, you had Channel 4 through Film 4, and you had the BBC. And as it happened, we have three excellent people in place who are making creative judgments. And we felt the overwhelming importance for the film community was to ensure that there was a minimum of 3 windows. And had we taken the money, there was every chance it would become 2 windows, that we would be in the frame for every person who got rejected or turned down. And we, ironically, as a way of dealing with the government's disappointment when we said no, we added 5 million to the Film 4. We had to have a good year this year. Added 5 million for the next 5 years, ring-fenced to Film 4's film budget. So we've actually kicked some more money into the arena, but said no to taking on the obligation of narrowing choice for the individual film producer.
Broadcasters in the UK, ITV in particular, are putting pressure on government to roll back the independent production quota, as I understand it. And Dish terms of trade. How real is this in the long term? I mean, we've seen they're crying poor. We know the issue with kids programming in the UK, the walk away from that. But is this a real threat, do you think?
Well, as you said in the introduction, I was involved in 2002 and 3 in changing the terms of trade in favour of the independents, because we had this almost absurd situation where after 20 years of Channel 4, we had, I think, almost 1,000 independent producers, none of scale. Not one of them had the scale, with the possible exception of Endemol, but they were not really a UK producer, to sustain themselves. So we changed the terms of trade. I think it was successful. It led to consolidation. It led to some public offerings, and it certainly led to, we estimate, well over £1 billion worth of investment capital entering the production industry. I would argue now, but just with this comes with the caveat that I do sit on the Channel 4 board, and I will be for at least another year, that possibly there's a rebalancing necessary, because we find ourselves in a situation of dealing with tremendously powerful independents now, who are able to dictate terms to us which really become quite marginal in terms of Channel 4's future. So you might have created a situation, it's possible, whereby Channel 4's own future becomes jeopardised by the current terms of trade.
So you become a gamekeeper, haven't you?
In a sense, I suppose I have, but I think it's more complicated than that. And I also don't think this is an insuperable problem. We're looking at the possibility of, I said that alarm bells down here, format rights. Should we have a greater share of format rights? Should we have a greater success fee in the event of things that we start up from scratch? If they go on into series 3, 4, 5, should we? And here's the danger: should we really be in a position when series 5 turns up, which is producing tremendous ratings for us, of having to bid against Sky or the BBC for a series that would never have existed had we not put the initial money in? Now, you can kind of live with that if when it goes on to another broadcaster, you've got some royalty payment. You know, as a producer, I'm able to be in Parliament because I get royalties on half a dozen of my movies. That's what keeps me going. Channel 4 is going to need additional royalty revenues if it's going to go into certainly reach 2020 in a healthy state. So yes, I think there is a discussion that needs to take place. I don't think it needs to take place that quickly because things are not bad at the moment. But I'd be very surprised if the terms of trade in 2015 are identical to what they are today.
Mm-hmm. We've concluded terms of trade with the ABC 12 months ago, and I think it's been proven, Kim, I think it's fair to say, successful. It's transparent, it's clear, it provides certainty. There's a lot of argy-bargy on those sorts of issues. We've got a meeting at 3:45 this afternoon with SBS.
No pressure. Look for the white smoke.
Where we think we can conclude terms of trade. But our problem is that, I mean, it's good faith of these two organisations that's led to this, but trying to do the same with the 9 network or the 10 network, especially now with Packer and Murdoch moving in, will be difficult. So the idea of Ofcom would be the ACMA as the Australian authority. Introducing some minimum terms of trade has been really tough for us. And I take your point entirely. The commercial reality is different, but you know, some of the programming that's been commissioned by the commercial free-to-airs is at rock bottom prices for us, and they're ripping our rights out left, right, and centre.
Jeff, one thing that is worth saying: I've over the years been members of 3 or 4 trade organisations which have split off from the one that was before because it hasn't been seen to be serving its new members. I think there's a quite serious issue that PACT have, which is an organisation I admire enormously, in that effectively it's become 2 organisations. It's an organisation at one end looking after the interests of a dozen or more large independents, and the organisation at the other end we're looking after the interests of, let's say, 300, 400, 500 much smaller independents who are surviving hand to mouth. And it's very, very difficult for a trade organisation to take account of the interests of those 2 quite different groups with quite different kind of sets of demands and quite different levels of clout, if you like. And I think that the sensitivity is not going to be between Channel 4 and PACT. It's going to be within PACT of how PACT can reconcile its want-to-be group, who are hugely reliant on Channel 4, and it's a very successful group who probably think they can survive without us. That's going to be tough.
Who have I got any? No, I won't take it any further. I just won't try to identify particular companies. No, we do have that tension. It's a clear tension, but luckily, we have broad consensus, and we haven't got anything on the scale of what you're talking about at the moment. We haven't got a tiger aspect to it. But look, is the panel comfortable if we throw that open to the audience and maybe get a couple of questions? Is there anybody that'd like to ask a question? Drew?
Just a couple of questions. Mark, are you able to maybe talk about the 2007 Labor promise to introduce charter obligations for local content, similar to the commercial stations? And secondly, could all of you make a bit of a prediction about the regulatory environment as it pertains to local content in about 10 years?
Labor, I think, when they're in opposition, talked about possibility of changing charter obligations, and I think as recently as a couple of months ago, there was again discussion about opening up the ABC charter, and if the government chooses to do that, then of course we welcome that and we'll actively engage in that process. Fundamentally, though, what they've done is they've given us funding to significantly increase the levels of Australian content, and particularly around Australian drama on ABC television. As Shaun pointed out, part of the loss in real funding that took place at the ABC over 20 years saw a dramatic decline, perilous decline in the levels of Australian drama. I'm glad we're able to turn that around. And I think it's not just on ABC One, but also the kind of drama that we're now able to invest in on ABC Three for children, I think is very significant. So obligated in the charter or not, we have the funding. The level of Australian content is growing significantly, and that's the way we'd like to proceed, and we'd like our funding to be consistent to enable us to deliver that. The A stands for Australian, and there was too little Australian content. I just think the regulatory debate's going to be a difficult one. I think the current regulatory framework for commercial free-to-air television was established in an era when they were oligopolists. There were 3 of them. They were the only way to reach audiences. They had massive power over advertisers. That's why we have these great Australian media moguls. The Packers, the Fairfaxes and the Murdochs, they were gatekeepers to the Australian public in many ways. The regulatory framework was created in that era. It's going to be a very different era when it all gets reviewed again. And it's not just percentage of Australian content on the main channels, but what happens are in this multi-channel dynamic, and whether there'll be a significant dilution. I think it's going to be a robust debate. The ABC's position in it will be strong levels of Australian content across all our broadcasting arms. But if in fact the government doesn't go down that road, then we need to be in a position to take up the slack for fear that the market will not deliver sustainable audiences that allows the Australian story in its myriad of forms to be told.
Yeah, I think the Minister's committed to an inquiry into sort of converged industry. I don't think we've set a date for it yet, but that certainly is on the...
Next year. The terms of reference due by Christmas.
Okay. Well, I think that's going to be a very significant part of that debate, and I agree with Mark's analysis as well. And if you looked at it from a commercial broadcaster's point of view for a moment, they will progressively see competitors coming in who carry no obligations, and therefore the political fairness of that will be questioned as well. And that, I think, triggers a whole new discussion. What it does continually refocus on, though, is the role of public broadcasting. And if everything else is in decline and the revenues are spread so thinly across so many players, none of whom have the capacity to deliver distinctive quality content, then you constantly refer back to the capacity of public broadcasters, the obligation of public broadcasters to do that, and the necessity for them to be funded to do that.
But that's the very same risk I was talking about earlier, and that's the argument that's being led. Yeah. They're still controlling spectrum, and it's a licensed spectrum from the public. Yeah. There must be obligations that go with being commercial broadcasters. You know, Mark, you're right to say that things are tough, but hang on, they got a $245 million break. They're out there telling Harold Mitchell that they want 5 to 7% increases in ad rates this year. When are we going to get a sensible, objective debate going in this country, in government, about the broadcasters and their future obligations? Yeah,
I think, as Shaun says, the Convergence Review sets the frame, sets the stage for that debate to really start to be hammered out in 2011. But they will point to the fact that now, every new TV set effectively that's being sold has a broadband cable into the back of it. Global content increasingly available, fast broadband into every home. In a sense, the regulatory environment was created in an era when the only way to access those audiences was with free-to-air television. And that's why the television licence was a licence to print money. Now, they're still making big money. My heart is not bleeding for them. But it's a different environment, and the reason it will be a complex debate will be all these other factors and all these other ways of reaching audiences that are now available, and in areas which are harder to regulate, clearly, than it is to regulate the operations of a broadcaster. So it's going to be complex. You can see where the arguments are emerging. And I would I think no one should take anything for granted on what the final policy outcome of this is. If you look at how long the debate around anti-siphoning in sport has gone on for, just one fragment of one sector, think of how complex it's going to be when we put all this on the table next year.
And the intensive lobbying that surrounds even quite a narrow review.
David, do you want to...
I just was pondering that in 2002-03, when we were putting the communications bill through, I used to use a phrase in Parliament that used to get a kind of weirdly disproportionate reaction from those in opposition to us at the time. I used to use the phrase that we were talking about here about a communications ecosystem or televisual ecosystem, and the opposition hated this word ecosystem. And I could never work out, understand it, and I'm beginning now to understand it. That I think they understood that the very nature of an ecosystem was delicate and required a lot of forethought, and the sense that you could do things that you couldn't undo if you got them wrong. And I think that was why I was getting this backlash to the notion of ecosystems, because it was forcing questions to get asked that the more purist market forces didn't really want asked. They wanted simple answers that freed them up and allowed them to make more money. And I can well see that the notion of an ecosystem is very inconvenient if that's what you're seeking.
Yes. Further questions? Jonathan Olsberg.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the issue of trust, which was mentioned earlier. And I suppose in the sphere of public sector, broadcasting, you can't have trust without impartiality. And certainly in the UK with the BBC, there have been issues about protecting impartiality with journalists who work in these spheres. So what are the best mechanisms to protect the impartiality that you have to have in the public broadcasting field in order to maintain that trust?
Well, I think it's absolutely fundamental to trust that you fulfil the obligations that exist under your charter, and we have clear editorial policies and guidelines for our staff around issues of fairness, balance, impartiality, ensuring that the ABC doesn't have a point of view itself, but is the host of a conversation where a plurality of views are heard. So we take it very seriously. We've just reviewed our editorial policies. We'll be briefing and training all our staff on them in the new year. We have a director of editorial policies who sits on our executive, who reports to me, and this is a continuing issue of focus for the board. I think, one of the things we were talking about earlier, it's often the failure of trust issues that can quickly throw an organisation into crisis. And often as an upshot of that crisis, you get knee-jerk policy responses that are not in the longer-term benefit of the organisation. To my mind, the separation in governance responsibility that you have from the BBC management and the BBC Trust is not an ideal corporate governance model, but it came as a response to a crisis, and that crisis was linked to issues of trust. So you need to be vigilant. And if in fact you fail around areas of trust, it allows all those enemies out there, some of whom are driven purely by their own commercial outcomes, to form a posse and come strongly against you. So we take it very seriously. It gets strong focus from us because it's central to our integrity and it's central to our relationship with the Australian public. We survey every year and with Newspoll, and that survey shows that 90% of the Australian public believes the ABC provides a valuable or very valuable service. And that is intrinsically linked to trust. And so it's at a cornerstone of what we do.
And we too, obviously, process the independence vested in our Act. These are all critical. I'd also emphasise there's a cultural aspect to this, that within organisations that have paid that level of respect to the requirement for trust and accuracy and fairness and balance, that you build an expectation, a constancy of performance. You can't take that for granted, so it has to be hand in hand with a proper, robust complaint system that's independent and fair. And we did some research, because we have our charter requires a certain, slightly narrower performance out of us in some areas, but I reflected on the research that we did recently with a number of language groups, Hindi, Italian and Arabic, and one of the things that came out, particularly with the Hindi language community, was their complete distrust of the Australian media generally, with the exclusion of SBS, and they constantly excluded us from this. And that distrust was built on the coverage. In this case, there was a general sense of distrust anyhow, but it was also particularly brought to light during the issues with Indian students in Melbourne and the coverage of that. And the point that we've been making to government since that research came out is that what happened to that community during that period was it retreated more and more, it circled the wagons, began reliant on its internal communications, but more particularly accessing information, as you can now, direct from New Delhi, and gave them a completely different view of what was taking place in Melbourne and the official response to it than was available through the Australian media. They had abandoned the Australian media on the grounds they didn't trust it. And so, we were proud that we stood out from that. But part of our obligation, and one thing we haven't talked about today, is the power of public broadcasting to influence behaviour of other broadcasters. McKinsey did a report for the BBC in the 90s, which specifically was there to address the scale of distinctiveness of coverage of public broadcasters across the world, and they did a ranking. But the finding that I was most intrigued by was the degree to which the standards set the expectations of public broadcasting had influenced the behaviours of other broadcasters. They simply couldn't afford to leave the ground for the public broadcaster to operate solely. So the commitment that we, as two public broadcasters have, particularly in the area of information, does, in my view, constantly lift the standards elsewhere.
David, we'll conclude on this.
Fantastically interesting area. Could actually have a panel all of its own to discuss it. It's also something I think that's shifting in a very interesting way in our definition of what impartiality is, or what our expectations are I think changing. Can I give two, or one I think probably quite vivid example? In the UK for most of my lifetime, the broadcasters, including public broadcasters, have been governed by what would broadly be called the national interest, operating in the national interest. But then you begin to question, well, what really, in a world of multi-platforms and far more access to news, what becomes a national interest? And a really, I think, wonderful example is happened this year, was the second very, very expensive review of the allegations and the situation surrounding Bloody Sunday, which many of you, I hope you're all familiar with, where 13 people were killed by British paratroopers in Belfast. And that had been kind of protected. When the original report came out by, at the time, relatively well-respected judge, he clearly believed at that point that the national interest was best served by quickly exonerating the army, saying it was all a terrible accident and nothing had gone wrong, it was fine. Now, as a result of pressure from human rights lawyers and the families involved in anything else, many, many years later, you'll eventually get an extremely expensive but proper tribunal that looks at this affair and comes to the exact opposite conclusion, which was this was an unjustifiable act. You then have the Prime Minister stand up in Parliament and publicly apologise for the fact that it ever happened, that it was an appalling situation, that it should never have happened. Now, I would argue, I mean, Cameron did himself a lot of good that day, right across the political spectrum, because what he actually did was served what I would call public interest 2010. That is, say, a new form or a new sense of what the public interest might be, which is a level of transparency, acknowledgement of guilt, and wanting to move on properly and not cover up. Now, that's very new stuff. We're going through it right now in Britain with the allegations of mistreatment and torture of Al-Qaeda suspects. I'm not sure where that's going to fall, but it's certainly being done in a different way and handled in a different way than it would have been a few years ago. I'm very lucky. I hope you won't forgive me. I hope you forgive me to tell you. I've seen a rough cut of a programme's going out later, in a month's time, by John Pilger, where John really looks long and hard. It's quite a long programme, at the issue of impartiality. I've seen it because my son's actually done the score for it, and so I saw it in a rough cut. And he questions, and I'm not picking on anyone here, but he questions a senior spokesperson from the BBC about this issue of impartiality. And he uses the example of coverage of the situation in Israel-Palestine. And she says, under his questioning, that it is absolutely true that whenever we raise any issues remotely critical of Israeli policy or Israeli actions, within seconds there's a phone call to anyone from the Director General down, certainly head of news, from the Israeli embassy complaining or asking for equal time or demanding that some explanation, that it happens within seconds. John then asked the great question, which is, do you get anything similar from the Palestinians? And there's a long answer. He said, well, she said, no. He said, well, do you know who the Palestinians spoke? Do you know who you might phone for their version of events? She said, well, no, there really isn't anyone. And what you quickly realise is impartiality can also be in the hands of those who've got an expensive and extensive rapid response mechanism, and those, possibly the victims in some situations, who don't. So I think this issue, Jonathan, I really think this issue of what is impartiality, how is it handled, how is it informed, how is it decimated, is wide open now for a reinterpretation. And we're looking at it in a new light, as I think exemplified by Cameron's decision to apologise for Bloody Sunday.
Well, would everybody please thank our panellists, Lord Puttnam, Mark Scott, Shaun Brown. Been very interesting. Thank you.